had always thought family dinners were safe, predictable, moments of comfort, but that night shattered every illusion I had. We were all seated around the polished oak table, the scent of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes filling the air, when my mother cleared her throat in that way that immediately made everyone pause. My stomach dropped before she even spoke, a cold twist of dread curling inside me. "I've made a decision," she said, her voice sharp and deliberate, and then she turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "From tonight, this house is no longer yours. I'm giving it to your sister." The words hit like a punch to the gut. I froze, unable to speak, feeling the warmth of the room turn into an icy spotlight on my humiliation. My sister's eyes widened, but not with guilt or sympathy, only triumph, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. My father shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze, and the rest of the family exchanged awkward glances, some sympathetic, some plainly entertained by my disgrace. Everything I had built in that house, every memory, every corner I had claimed as my own, felt stripped away in an instant. I could hear the faint clink of cutlery on plates, the murmurs of relatives who had no idea the depth of my attachment, their curiosity like a magnifying glass on my embarrassment. It wasn't just about losing a house. It was about being erased, disregarded, made irrelevant in the story of my own family. I wanted to protest, to scream that this was unfair, that I had poured my life into that home, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I sat there, frozen, as the reality sank in. My place in the family, the one I thought was secure, had been publicly revoked. The shame burned, mingling with a sharp, bitter anger that I couldn't yet name, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of being underestimated, dismissed, and replaced. Even as my cheeks flushed with humiliation, I noticed something dangerous in that moment. The way my mother's decision had painted her as powerful, and me as weak. The dinner table had become a stage, and everyone was watching. I was aware of every eye, every whisper, every subtle nod of agreement or curiosity. The FOMO of being left out, of no longer belonging, tore at me. I had been so close to my own family, yet suddenly, I was a stranger in the place I had called home for years. That night, I realized two things. First, that this family had underestimated me, and second, that humiliation alone would not break me. The sting of rejection, the sharp contrast between my sister's triumph and my own vulnerability, lit a fire inside me that I didn't yet understand. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a polite smile, hiding the storm brewing beneath. On the outside, I seemed broken. Inside, something had shifted, and I knew this was only the beginning of a story they had no idea I was about to write. Growing up, I had always sensed that my mother's heart leaned heavily toward my sister, but I had learned to mask the hurt, convincing myself it wasn't true. Birthdays were the first signs. While I received modest gifts, my sister's celebrations were extravagant affairs, complete with designer dresses, parties she never asked for, and cameras capturing every smile for the family album. I remember one particular birthday when I had quietly hoped for a simple acknowledgement, just a card, a hug, anything, but my mother breezed past me, humming to herself as she fussed over my sister's sparkling presents. The contrast stung more than I could admit. It wasn't just birthdays. Every milestone seemed to tilt in her favor. When our father left hints about the family inheritance, it was always to her, always in hushed tones that I overheard accidentally, never directly to me. I learned to smile politely, to nod, to suppress the swelling tide of resentment that threatened to spill out. Even during school achievements or personal accomplishments, my mother's praise was sparse for me but overflowing for my sister, painting a picture where my worth seemed incidental, almost invisible. The emotional neglect was subtle but relentless. I remember studying late into the night for exams, hoping for even a flicker of pride. But my efforts were met with silence. Meanwhile, my sister's smallest achievements were celebrated as if they were groundbreaking discoveries. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it didn't matter, that love wasn't measured in recognition, but the quiet gnaw of rejection never ceased. It created a sense of invisibility, as if I existed only when I served to highlight her favoritism toward my sister. Even family conversations were skewed. My opinions were dismissed or interrupted, while hers were amplified, taken seriously, cherished. The contrast between how we were treated was a constant, sharp reminder of my place, always second, always overlooked. And yet, I endured it quietly, mastering the art of invisibility, keeping my grievances tucked inside where no one could see. I had no idea that those years of being ignored, belittled, and overlooked were quietly shaping a resilience that would later become my greatest weapon. By the time that dinner came, all those moments, the silent disappointments, the small betrayals, the unspoken favoritism, coalesced into a vivid memory that made my mother's public decision even more piercing. The injustice I felt that night was not a singular event. It was decades in the making, a lifetime of being told without words that I mattered less. I could feel the familiar sting of being unseen, the same feeling I had carried through every ignored birthday, every subtle slight, every whispered inheritance hint. It was all there, crystallized into one moment of shock and humiliation. And yet, for the first time, I realized the truth. Those years of neglect had also given me something they hadn't expected, a quiet, simmering strength. I left the dinner table before anyone could notice the tears I refused to shed, retreating to my old bedroom where the walls seemed both comforting and suffocating. The house felt alien now, every familiar corner taunting me with memories that had once been mine. I sank onto the edge of my bed, head in my hands, replaying my mother's words over and over. This house is no longer yours. The finality of it echoed in my mind, louder than any argument I could have made. How had it come to this? How had I, her child, been so casually erased? The humiliation burned like acid, but beneath it, something else began to stir, a cold, calculated awareness. I could feel the raw pulse of anger, sharp and insistent. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine not just my own loss, but the vulnerability of those who had wronged me. Every slight, every overlooked birthday, every whispered inheritance hint swirled together into a portrait of favoritism and neglect that I had endured silently for years. But silence could change. It could be weaponized, and suddenly I realized I didn't have to stay powerless. I began mentally charting the possibilities, testing each scenario like pieces on a chessboard. What if I leveraged the house's hidden value? What if I quietly secured documentation or proof of the financial disparities that had been ignored for years? Every avenue that had been closed to me before suddenly opened under the lens of strategy. I imagined small, precise moves, quiet victories that would eventually build to something undeniable. Even as fear crept in, whispering doubts about overreaching or failure, the fire of determination grew. The humiliation was still fresh, a bitter taste that made my jaw clench, but now it fueled a clarity I hadn't known I possessed. I pictured my mother's smug expression and my sister's triumphant smirk, and the thought of turning the tables, even just a little, sent a thrill through me. I wasn't plotting out of malice alone. I was reclaiming what had been denied, asserting that I existed and that being underestimated was a mistake they would regret. By the time the house settled into nighttime silence, I had sketched the first faint outlines of a plan in my mind. It was imperfect, incomplete, and risky, but it was mine, born from the betrayal and humiliation I had endured. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a subtle, fierce confidence that the next move would be mine to make. And in that quiet room, as shadows stretched across the walls, I understood something vital. Anger without direction is destructive, but anger with purpose is unstoppable. That realization was the seed of everything that was about to unfold. The next morning, I couldn't escape the ripple effects of that dinner. Word had already spread through the family grapevine, and the messages, calls, and side glances came faster than I could process. My sister, of course, reveled in the attention, her laughter sharp and confident, as if she had orchestrated every detail. Extended family members whispered behind half-closed doors, some curious, some gleeful at my discomfort. It felt as though my entire life had been reduced to a spectacle, and I was the punchline. Some tried to reach out with concern. My cousin called late, voice trembling as she said, "I can't believe she did that to you." My best friend sent long texts, offering support, reminding me of my worth. Those gestures were tiny lifelines, but they couldn't erase the sting of public dismissal. Meanwhile, others treated it like entertainment, teasing remarks at work, sarcastic jokes from neighbors, even distant relatives asking, "So, does that mean you're moving out soon?" The contrast was brutal. Some saw me as a victim deserving sympathy, others as someone irrelevant, easily written out of the story. Inside me, the mix of anger and disbelief twisted tighter. I felt like a ghost in my own life, haunting spaces that had once been mine without permission. My sister's casual arrogance, my mother's cold approval, the extended families divided, loyalties. They all made me question who, if anyone, would truly believe my side of the story. Even the few who sympathized couldn't grasp the full weight of years of favoritism and silent neglect. I wanted to scream, to demand acknowledgement of the injustice, but a voice inside warned me against impulsive confrontation. Every glance, from a relative, every whispered comment, felt loaded with judgment. Some were allies in disguise. Others were predators in polite clothing, waiting for me to falter. I realized that to survive this, I would need strategy, patience, and precision. The humiliation wasn't over. It had merely shifted to a larger stage. As I replayed conversations and observed reactions, a question loomed over me. Would anyone truly see the truth? Or would I remain invisible, a shadow beneath my sister's spotlight? The uncertainty gnawed at me, sharpening the edge of resolve. Something had to give, and I knew deep down that the next move had to be mine. The question wasn't if I would act. It was whether anyone would even notice when I did. I spent the following days in a haze of disbelief and quiet rage. But the more I lingered in the house, the more I noticed details I had never paid attention to before. The walls that had once felt familiar now seemed like silent witnesses to my family's favoritism. Yet they also held secrets, documents tucked in drawers, ledgers collecting dust, and the faint hint of investments my mother never mentioned. I began rifling through files, not recklessly, but methodically, tracing every note, every receipt, every paper that might reveal what had truly been left behind. It didn't take long for me to discover that the house itself was more than just a structure. Hidden behind a false panel in the basement, I found deeds, old appraisals, and records that revealed its true value far exceeded anything my sister or mother realized. This wasn't just a sentimental home. It was an asset, a potential leverage point I could wield if I played my cards right. The realization sent a rush through me, a mix of excitement, vindication, and the tiniest spark of fear. I knew I had stumbled upon something powerful, something that could shift the balance entirely. But it wasn't only the house. As I dug deeper, other hidden inheritances emerged. Financial accounts that had been quietly set aside, letters hinting at properties or investments previously overlooked, and legal technicalities that could be used to challenge the distribution. Each discovery tightened the coil of tension in my chest. Suddenly, the humiliation I had endured at the dinner seemed like fuel, not defeat. I wasn't just powerless anymore. I had leverage. Silent weapons my family had no idea I even knew existed. The thought of what I could do with this knowledge made my pulse quicken. I imagined the look on my mother's face if she realized I understood the value of what she thought she had given away. I pictured my sister, smug and triumphant, frozen, when her newly claimed triumph could be quietly undermined. For the first time, I felt a thrilling mixture of anticipation and strategic clarity. I had been ignored and underestimated for years, and now, armed with secrets and overlooked opportunities, I could turn the tide. I paused, letting the gravity of what I had uncovered sink in. Every hidden document, every forgotten account, every neglected asset was a thread I could pull to unravel the facade of superiority my sister and mother projected. The humiliation, the whispered dismissals, the public spectacle of the dinner, all of it paled in comparison to the potential I now held. I wasn't just planning to survive anymore. I was planning to reclaim, to assert, and to demonstrate that being underestimated had been their greatest mistake. I knew I couldn't act recklessly. The slightest misstep would give my mother and sister the upper hand again. So I approached this quietly, deliberately, starting with the legal side of things. I contacted a lawyer I trusted, someone who understood the subtleties of inheritance law and the quiet loopholes that often go unnoticed. At first, the lawyer seemed skeptical, just as my family might be. But as I laid out the documents I had discovered, the hidden deeds, the overlooked accounts, the subtle irregularities, I could see their eyes widen. Suddenly, what had seemed like a minor advantage transformed into tangible leverage. I began negotiating quietly, securing a claim over an asset that had been overlooked in my mother's careful distribution. It wasn't flashy or dramatic yet, but it was mine, legally indisputable, and just enough to start shifting the power dynamic. The small victories mattered. Every document filed, every clause uncovered, every legal step taken was a breadcrumb leading toward something far larger than anyone expected. The thrill of control, even in these minor steps, was intoxicating. Meanwhile, my family remained oblivious. My sister continued flaunting her triumph, my mother basked in her perceived superiority, and I watched from the shadows, carefully calculating. They underestimated me because I didn't flaunt my knowledge. I moved silently, like a storm gathering strength. That underestimation became a weapon itself. Every casual glance, every whispered conversation I overheard reinforced the contrast framing. They thought they were dominant, and I appeared weak. But inside, I was anything but weak. Every legal maneuver, every strategic interaction with professionals, every carefully concealed step built a sense of anticipation and quiet power. The humiliation of the dinner, the ignored birthdays, the whispered slights, all of it fueled this first taste of reversal. It wasn't just about the asset. It was about proving to myself that I could outmaneuver the very people who had dismissed me my entire life. By the time I hung up the phone after my final meeting with the lawyer, a calm, deliberate confidence settled over me. The first move had been made, and it was subtle, precise, and undeniable. My family had no idea the game had begun, and that ignorance was the sharpest edge of all. I could almost hear their smug laughter in my mind, and imagine it shattering when the tide inevitably turned. For the first time since that dinner, I felt that the humiliation I had endured could be transformed into something powerful. Something that would make them finally see me, not as the ignored child, but as someone they had gravely underestimated. A week later, the opportunity for another display of my family's cruelty arrived. My sister had organized a so-called celebration at her new accomplishment, a gathering filled with friends, relatives, and neighbors, all carefully selected to witness her triumph. Invitations had been sent to everyone I knew, except me. I wasn't supposed to be there, not officially, but I made sure to attend anyway, blending into the background as an unnoticed shadow. Every laugh, every compliment she received, every toast offered in her honor was a knife twisting in the memory of my own public humiliation. She was radiant, of course, the center of attention, sparkling in a dress that my mother had once adored, now paraded by the favored child. People murmured, complimented her choices, and laughed at stories I knew were exaggerated or rewritten to paint her as flawless. And all the while, I stayed quiet, drinking in every detail. My sister had no idea that I saw everything. The smug glances, the whispered boasts, the carefully orchestrated applause. Her confidence was an illusion, a bubble that hadn't yet been pierced by reality. My mother was there too, smiling with pride, clearly relishing the social validation that came with her favoritism. I could feel the tension tighten in my chest, the familiar sting of invisibility washing over me again. But unlike before, this time, I didn't feel powerless. I observed, cataloged, and mentally noted every slight, every misstep, every way they had publicly exposed themselves. The humiliation was theirs to carry, even if they didn't realize it yet. Every conversation I overheard, every toast that lauded my sister's supposed superiority, only strengthened my resolve. I imagined the small, precise ways I could undermine her narrative later. the threads I could pull to reveal truth beneath the facade. The energy in the room was intoxicating, a mix of envy, admiration, and complacency on their part. And I was the silent storm waiting at the edge of it all. As the night progressed, I felt a mix of anger and anticipation, a simmering tension that tightened with each passing moment. I knew they believed they had won, that I had no power here, no leverage, no voice. And yet, in the quiet corners of the room, watching their pride swell, I realized that their downfall was closer than they imagined. One small misstep, one carefully timed move, and everything could shift. And as I lingered there, invisible yet all-seeing, the question settled in my mind like a warning. When the time came, would they even recognize it? I knew I couldn't unmake years of favoritism alone. The plan needed people who understood systems, patience, and subtlety. So I began recruiting allies not with speeches or drama, but with careful conversations framed as questions rather than accusations. First was my college friend Maya, the one who had listened to me through every late-night breakdown. I met her for coffee and, without theatrics, laid out the facts I had uncovered. Maya didn't react with shock so much as steady focus. She asked practical questions, probed timelines, and helped me see where a narrative could be built from the fragments I had found. Her calm was exactly what I needed. Maya agreed to help gather the practical pieces, photographs, bank statements she could access through her contacts, and a timeline that made the pattern of favoritism undeniable. She had a knack for organization that turned my scattered discoveries into an evidence trail that could be followed. I felt relief watching a raw hurt become something orderly and actionable. Then there was the lawyer, the professional who made legality feel like a tool instead of a threat. I returned to him with a cleaner stack of documents, and he walked me through options with a steady voice. Contesting transfers, challenging the validity of certain signatures, or demonstrating that my mother's distribution had overlooked formal duties. Each possibility sounded technical but promising. He warned me about expense and delay, but he also offered contingency plans that minimized public drama while ensuring we had leverage if they tried to steamroll us. Aunt Lorraine was the last piece. She was an unlikely ally, distant enough to not be entangled in daily family theatrics, and outspoken enough to be taken seriously by other relatives. When I reached out, she didn't gasp or feign innocence. She offered names and memories, conversations she had heard, promises my mother had once made in private. Her testimony wouldn't be theatrical, but it would be credible. She agreed to gently nudge certain family members and to confirm what she remembered if the need arose. Her willingness to show up quietly for truth was worth more than any dramatic declaration. Together, the three of them and I sketched a plan that balanced legal precision with social pressure. We would avoid grand public confrontations. Instead, we would create a slow, undeniable erosion of the story my mother had carefully curated. Maya would compile appraisals, bank records, and timestamps. The lawyer would draft formal requests and, if necessary, prepare filings that compelled disclosure. Aunt Lorraine would plant subtle reminders with relatives who mattered, those whose corroboration would cut through polite family deniability. Each role complemented the others and reduced reliance on emotion. As meetings accumulated, I found myself mapping scenarios aloud like chess. If they denied an account existed, we had third-party confirmations. If they contested dates, we had time-stamped receipts. If they questioned my motives, we would present a calm, factual record rather than emotion. Voicing each contingency stripped away a lot of fear. It replaced chaos with a path forward. The strategic monologue became a ritual, my way of rehearsing composure and predicting counters. At night, alone in my room, I rehearsed the composure I would need. I practiced telling the truth plainly, without the heat that my mother used to dismiss. I worked on pauses, neutral phrasing, and the kind of language that forced a response rather than a dismissal. My allies were technicians of truth, precise, patient, and utterly pragmatic. Their presence reframed my humiliation into methodical action. We set a single binding rule: no grandstanding. We would not be baited into emotional theatrics. We would force accountability through procedure and corroboration. That discipline felt like mercy. It elevated our case from personal grievance to undeniable fact. Walking out of our last meeting with a binder of documents and a list of witnesses, I felt a steadier confidence than any brazen retaliation could have given me. The machine was small and quiet, but it would be relentless. I was no longer merely the embarrassed child at the table. I was an architect of consequence, and they would soon learn it. The moment of revelation came quietly, but its impact would ripple through the family for weeks. I had spent months meticulously assembling every shred of evidence, every overlooked account, and every hidden clause that my mother had assumed would remain buried. What I discovered wasn't just a forgotten asset or a simple legal technicality, it was a lever of unimaginable power. There had been a second will drafted years ago, one that my mother had never disclosed, leaving significant inheritance and property in my name. It wasn't public, and until now, no one suspected it existed. I didn't rush to announce it. I waited for the perfect moment when the contrast between my sister's triumph and my invisibility would be most striking. I had built anticipation not only in my mind, but in the quiet observation of their arrogance, in the smug expressions my sister wore, as if the world had granted her the victory. And now, armed with the legal documentation and a plan to reveal it strategically, I held the power they had never anticipated. The first time I hinted at it in conversation, subtle and casual, their reactions were telling. My sister's smile faltered, a flash of unease crossing her features before she forced the usual bravado. My mother raised an eyebrow, momentarily thrown off her carefully curated pedestal. Even my father, who had always tried to stay neutral, leaned forward, sensing the shift. For once I wasn't the overlooked child, the powerless one. They were the ones unsettled, uncertain, scrambling to calculate the implications of what I now controlled. The day I formally secured legal confirmation of the inheritance, I could feel the tension radiating through our family dynamic. Every discussion at the next gathering was charged with a new awareness. I was no longer a passive observer. I had the means to claim not only recognition, but tangible assets that my mother had thought were entirely under her control. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every subtle hesitation from my sister was a visible crack in the armor she had built over years of favoritism. Even the family gatherings that had once been arenas of my humiliation now felt charged with suspense. I could see the gears turning in their heads, the questions forming behind carefully neutral expressions. How much did she know? What could she claim? How had we underestimated her for so long? That realization, that sweet, quiet satisfaction of hidden leverage, was intoxicating. I had transformed years of passive suffering into undeniable power, and I reveled in the contrast between their ignorance and my meticulous planning. As I prepared for the public disclosure, my internal monologues ran through every potential reaction, every defense they might try to deploy. I imagined their confidence crumbling, their smug assertions meeting quiet but devastating truths. This was the moment where all the small victories converged. The hidden accounts, the overlooked clauses, the patient documentation, culminating in a revelation that would redefine our family hierarchy. They had built a world where I seemed irrelevant. I was about to rewrite it entirely. I felt the thrill of control coursing through me, tempered with precision. Every step was deliberate, every disclosure timed, every word calculated. This was no longer personal embarrassment. It was justice, strategic and inevitable. The household that had once cast me aside, that had ignored my worth, would finally confront the consequences of underestimating me. And in that quiet, simmering anticipation, I realized the most powerful revenge isn't spectacle. It's the undeniable shift in status that leaves the arrogant scrambling while the underestimated emerge untouchable. The night of the confrontation arrived with a tension that felt almost electric. It wasn't a shouting match or a dramatic scene staged for maximum humiliation. It was precise, deliberate, and unavoidable. My family had gathered at another one of their ostentatious dinners, confident in their social dominance, sure that I was powerless and invisible. I walked in calmly, deliberately, carrying nothing but the quiet assurance of preparation and truth. Their laughter and chatter momentarily paused when I appeared, but they quickly reassumed their composure, not realizing that the room's balance was about to shift entirely. I let the initial moments pass, observing, cataloging. My sister's smile, so quick and confident before, faltered as subtle glances were exchanged. My mother's eyes darted briefly toward the stack of documents in my hand, though they didn't know what it meant. I began speaking, not angrily, not accusatorially, but with calm precision, outlining the facts that had been hidden from everyone: the second will, the overlooked inheritances, the documentation proving years of favoritism and mismanagement. Each revelation landed with measured impact, a weight that even the most skeptical relative could not dismiss. I could see it. The first flickers of doubt cross faces that had once dismissed me. My sister's posture stiffened. She tried to laugh it off, but the room no longer laughed with her. My mother, usually unflappable, shifted uncomfortably, caught between denial and the undeniable proof in front of her. I had anticipated every excuse, every attempt to deflect, and calmly, systematically dismantled them with facts, legal confirmation, and corroborating witnesses. It was quiet, clinical, but devastatingly effective. The air in the room changed. Where once I had felt invisible, overlooked, and powerless, now all eyes were on me, not with mockery, but with attention, disbelief, and reluctant respect. Friends, distant relatives, even neighbors who had once murmured about my supposed inferiority now whispered questions to one another. How had she known? How had she prepared so meticulously? The status tension that had defined our family for decades shifted in an instant. For the first time, the family hierarchy was clear. I was no longer the ignored child. I was the one holding truth, control, and leverage. As I concluded, the room hung in stunned silence. My sister's triumphant smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, controlled panic. My mother's shoulders slumped slightly, the mask of superiority cracking for the first time in years. The emotional payoff surged in me, a mix of relief, vindication, and the quiet joy of justice served. Every humiliation, every slight, every overlooked birthday had culminated in this moment, and it was more satisfying than I could have imagined. Yet the most satisfying part wasn't vengeance for the sake of cruelty. It was the validation of years of patience, intelligence, and resilience. Karma had done its work, not violently, but methodically. My family had underestimated me, ignored me, and elevated my sister at my expense. And now, publicly, the scales had tipped. The quiet dignity with which I delivered the revelations contrasted sharply with their flustered, exposed reactions, amplifying the sense of justice. By the end of the evening, the tables had turned completely. Where once I had been humiliated, now I held undeniable power. Where once I had been overlooked, now I was the center of attention for the truth I wielded. And though there was still a complicated mix of lingering resentment and family tension, I felt the intoxicating satisfaction of having transformed betrayal and rejection into an elegant, unstoppable reckoning. The dinner, once a symbol of my lowest humiliation, had become the stage for the highest triumph I had ever imagined. The days following the confrontation were surreal. The family dynamics that had once felt rigid and immovable were suddenly fluid, uncertain, and tinged with an unspoken respect, or perhaps wariness toward me. My sister avoided direct eye contact, her usual arrogance replaced with hesitation. My mother, who had once seemed untouchable, spoke more cautiously, carefully measuring her words, as if each one could shift the fragile balance I now held. Even my father, who had quietly observed for years, nodded subtly in acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. The tension that had long defined our interactions began to loosen, replaced by a mix of disbelief and grudging recognition. Messages and conversations that once stung with judgment now carried a different energy. Cousins who had whispered behind closed doors approached with tentative questions, careful not to upset the new order. Friends who had watched my struggle unfold expressed amazement and admiration, offering congratulations that felt deeply validating. I realized that the humiliation of the past, the years of being ignored, had not broken me. They had built me. Each slight, each overlooked birthday, every subtle favoritism had sharpened my awareness, patience, and determination. Alone in my thoughts, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I remembered the sting of that first family dinner, the sudden and public rejection, and the hollow ache of feeling invisible. I remembered the quiet nights spent poring over documents, plotting strategy, and rehearsing conversations, and the allies who had silently strengthened my position. The path had been painstaking, sometimes frightening, and yet each challenge had strengthened a resolve I hadn't fully recognized in myself. Empowerment came not just from victory, but from the realization of my own capabilities. I had taken years of neglect and transformed them into leverage, patience, and precision. I had orchestrated a shift in status, demonstrating that being underestimated was not a permanent sentence. Relief accompanied this empowerment, a gentle release of the tension I had carried for so long. The public humiliation that had once defined me had been replaced by quiet control, dignity, and a clear recognition of my worth. Even as the family began to adjust to the new reality, I understood that growth had been as much internal as it was external. I was no longer the child who waited silently for approval. I was a person capable of turning injustice into strategy, betrayal into awareness, and rejection into power. In the end, the emotional aftermath was not just about their reactions. It was about my own transformation. I had endured, I had adapted, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and undeniably seen. Sitting alone in the quiet of my own space, away from the calculated chaos of family gatherings and whispered judgments, I felt the full weight of everything I had endured. There was a sorrow that no victory could erase, the sense of lost connection, of love that had been conditional and uneven, and the moments I had missed hoping for acknowledgement that never came. Even with the legal victories and the reversal of status, I mourned the family I had wanted but never fully received. That grief was heavy, real, and yet strangely clarifying. At the same time, I recognized a profound growth within myself. Every insult, every slight, every overlooked achievement had forced me to cultivate patience, resilience, and strategic thinking. I had learned to observe, calculate, and act with precision, turning humiliation into insight and neglect into a roadmap for empowerment. The strength I had gained wasn't born from malice or vengeance. It was forged in the quiet moments of reflection, in the disciplined attention to detail, and in the unwavering belief that I mattered, even when no one else seemed to. The lessons were unmistakable. I had learned that validation from others is fleeting, but self-respect and agency are enduring. I had learned that being underestimated can be a gift if it allows time to prepare, to learn, and to grow quietly until the moment of reckoning. Most importantly, I had learned that justice, when pursued thoughtfully and deliberately, is far more satisfying than rash retaliation. The satisfaction of seeing truth acknowledged, of witnessing arrogance tempered by reality, offered a catharsis that no shouting or spectacle could match. As I reflected, I felt a quiet pride in the person I had become. The shame and humiliation of the past had been transformed into awareness, empowerment, and clarity. I was no longer the overlooked child, the invisible sibling, or the target of favoritism. I was someone who had endured, observed, and acted. And in that endurance, I found a deep, lasting relief. The knowledge that even in a family fractured by bias and neglect, I had claimed my place with dignity and strength. For anyone listening, watching or relating, I hope they understand that betrayal and rejection, while painful, can become catalysts for transformation. The heartache I endured, the invisibility I felt, and the humiliation I suffered were all real. But they did not define me. What defines me is what I chose to do with it. To rise, to act, and to reclaim my story. And in that reclamation lies the true catharsis, not only for me, but for anyone who has ever felt unseen, underestimated, or dismissed. Looking back, the story isn't just about a house, inheritance, or public vindication. It's about fairness, justice, and the power of patience. Every step I took, every document uncovered, every quiet strategy employed, was a testament to thinking carefully, rather than reacting impulsively. My family's favoritism and betrayal could have broken me, but instead, it taught me to be clever, deliberate, and resilient. The satisfaction I feel now isn't from seeing them embarrassed. It's from knowing I stayed true to myself while reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Justice was never loud or vengeful. It was precise, unavoidable, and undeniable. Patience became my secret weapon, turning years of neglect into insight, humiliation into leverage. I learned that cleverness, coupled with calm strategy, outweighs impulsive confrontation every time. The contrasts, the ignored child versus the triumphant sibling, the powerless versus the empowered, highlighted the magnitude of the journey, and made the eventual payoff all the more meaningful. As I close this chapter, I feel an overwhelming sense of closure. I am no longer defined by favoritism, rejection, or betrayal. Instead, I am defined by resilience, intelligence, and the courage to claim my own story. For anyone who has ever been overlooked or dismissed, this is proof. Patience, fairness, and clever action can transform injustice into triumph. And even the deepest wounds can lead to empowerment and lasting satisfaction. Even as I savor the closure and quiet victory, I can't help but notice the subtle cracks still lingering in the family facade. There are hints, whispered moments, and unresolved tensions that suggest this isn't the final chapter. Perhaps another sibling, cousin, or relative has been quietly scheming, waiting for the right moment to challenge, expose, or test me. I've learned to expect the unexpected, and while I rest in this triumph, I know that vigilance, cleverness, and patience will always be my allies.